The sun hovered mercilessly over Fort Harrington's training yard, a relentless glare that made the dust rise in lazy, golden swirls. It was mid-afternoon, and most of the cadets had already spent hours running drills, wrestling with fatigue, their muscles humming with exhaustion. Sweat-slicked foreheads gleamed under the harsh light, and the rhythmic thud of boots against the dirt was the only sound that mattered, until a shadow fell over the yard, stretching long and deliberate across the worn mat lines. She walked in. Lieutenant Ava Rourke. Even before anyone saw her clearly, the cadets felt it, a shift in the air. Something about the way the heat seemed to bend around her, the deliberate calm in every step, the taut readiness in her posture. The chatter of the yard stuttered, then faded into whispers. "That's the new close combat instructor," a cadet murmured, craning his neck to get a better view. His voice carried more curiosity than respect, but the weight of it made others turn. "She's tiny," another said, almost dismissively, like a small package could not possibly contain anything dangerous. "Bet she's all talk." By the time Ava's boots crunched over the gravel, the whispers had formed a ripple through the crowd. Even the instructors paused, sensing something, electric, almost dangerous about the way she moved. Ava didn't respond. Her eyes scanned the yard in one fluid sweep, and the cadets felt the intensity settle on them like a winter frost, silent, absolute, unavoidable. Her uniform was pristine, every crease perfect, every badge in place, yet her presence made the chaos of adolescent bravado feel small and ridiculous. She stopped at the center of the yard, where the mat lay flat and waiting, dust motes dancing in the sunlight around her feet. The mat was old, scuffed from years of training cadets who thought they were tougher than they were, who thought they knew combat before they ever faced it. Ava knelt for a moment, checking the surface with trained fingers, her eyes scanning for imperfections or weaknesses, her mind calculating distances, angles, timing. Every cadet's heartbeat seemed loud under the sun's heavy watch. Then a voice cracked through the air, loud enough for all to hear but laced with bravado. "Ma'am, how about a friendly spar?" It was Cadet Brooks, tall, broad-shouldered, with the kind of confidence born from ego rather than experience. He grinned, a little too wide, as if daring her to laugh, to refuse, to reveal any human flaw. The crowd shifted, uncertain. A few snickers punctuated the tension, but most cadets sensed immediately that this was not going to be ordinary. They all leaned forward slightly, some instinctively drawing their phones out, ready to capture either humiliation or spectacle. Ava didn't answer immediately. Instead, she straightened, letting the sun glint off her gloves, revealing only a slight sheen of sweat along the line of her jaw. Her lips curved into the faintest smile, just enough to unsettle and intrigue simultaneously. "Very well," she said finally, her voice calm, controlled like the quiet before a storm. "But light contact. I don't want anyone hurt." Brooks laughed, a little too loud, a little too sure. "Don't worry, ma'am. We'll be gentle," he said, though the gleam in his eyes betrayed the challenge underneath. Two more cadets stepped forward, clearly emboldened by Brooks' bravado. They mirrored his grin, stretching their necks to show confidence they didn't quite feel. "We'd like to join, ma'am, 3-on-1. For learning purposes," one said, trying to sound casual. The crowd snickered again, the sound mixing with the warm, heavy wind that whipped through the training yard. Ava's eyes flicked over the three, one by one, assessing without hesitation. In that moment, each cadet felt as if the lieutenant could see through muscle, skin, and ego, right into the essence of their preparedness. Her nod was slight, calculated, not a gesture of fear, not a gesture of arrogance, simply acceptance. "Fine," she said, "but remember what I said, light contact only." They stepped into the center of the mat, forming a triangle around her. Brooks cracked his knuckles in mock showmanship, tossing a glance toward the cadets on the sidelines, who recorded with wide-eyed anticipation. The air was electric. Something about the stillness that followed made hearts pound a little faster. Cadets who had never even done close combat training felt a chill race up their spines. There was a primal tension now, one that didn't belong in a military academy but somewhere far more dangerous. Ava shifted her stance, minimal, almost imperceptible, a fraction of a second, a twitch of weight. It was enough. The cadets felt it even if they couldn't yet name it. "Ready when you are," she said, and the sound was not loud, but it carried over the yard like a whip crack. Brooks lunged first, fast, wild, aggressive. It was the kind of attack designed to intimidate, to force a reaction. But Ava didn't move, not immediately. The world seemed to compress around her, the noise of the yard fading, leaving only the subtle shifts of weight, the faintest exhalations, the rhythm of intent. Then, impossibly, Brooks stumbled before he even reached her. The cadets gasped, phones clicked frantically, murmurs rippled. "What the hell just happened?" one muttered, pushing his friend's shoulder as if to see if reality had shifted. Ava's smile didn't widen. She simply adjusted her position, subtle, fluid, like water reshaping itself around a stone. And in that instant, the next cadet realized she wasn't just calm, she was deadly. The third cadet froze. His bravado faltered as Ava's gaze settled on him, steady, unflinching. There was a warning there, unspoken but clear. You do not understand what you're about to face. The training yard, usually a place of controlled chaos, became a theater of suspense. Every eye was fixed on her, every muscle tensed, every heartbeat echoing like a drumline in a canyon. The sunlight seemed sharper, the dust more visible, the anticipation almost unbearable. And yet Ava didn't move. She waited, patient, precise. She had learned that the longest moment before action often contained more power than the action itself. Every cadet on the mat, and every cadet watching, felt that power as a physical weight pressing down. And as the first cadet took another step forward, determined to strike despite the unease clawing at him, the crowd held its breath. Because no one had ever seen combat like this before. And no one, not even Brooks, would walk away unshaken from the mat that day. The whispers had started when she entered the yard. By the time she raised a finger to signal the start, the entire training corps understood. This sparring match would not be normal. And it wouldn't last long. The sun glinted off her gloves one last time, the air thick with anticipation. The first strike was about to land. Brooks' grin had barely settled when the next two cadets stepped forward. They were younger, thinner, eager to prove themselves, but their confidence was fueled entirely by bravado. They circled Ava with nervous energy, shifting weight from foot to foot, as though just by moving they could summon some measure of strength she couldn't see. "3 on 1, one of them said, puffing his chest. "We're just learning, ma'am, totally fair." Ava's eyes scanned them, unblinking, nodding every twitch, every subtle muscle tension, every micro-expression that betrayed doubt beneath forced courage. Her fingers flexed inside the gloves, tight but relaxed. "Fine," she said, voice low, calm, controlled. "But remember, light contact. I do not want anyone injured." The three cadets exchanged looks, a mix of excitement and disbelief. They thought they had scored some sort of victory before even stepping onto the mat. They had no idea how badly they had miscalculated. Brooks cracked his knuckles again a little too loudly and leaned into the circle. "We've got this, ma'am. Don't worry." He flashed the camera on his phone to the cadets around the yard, a silent dare. "Watch me beat her." The cadets on the sidelines circled around, some with phones out, others just craning their necks, eager for spectacle. A hush settled over the yard, thick and expectant, broken only by the occasional gust of wind that sent dust dancing in erratic spirals. Ava shifted her stance just slightly, imperceptibly, and the subtle adjustment alone was enough to make all three cadets hesitate. "What is she?" one muttered under his breath, and Brooks shot him a look that said, "Don't chicken out now." Ava's voice cut through the tension, soft but unmistakable. "Start when you're ready." Brooks lunged first, a broad, clumsy motion meant to intimidate. But before his fist even reached her, he stumbled on the edge of his own footwork, thrown off balance by a subtle shift in her weight. His body twisted awkwardly, and he barely kept from falling. The cadets gasped, phones clicked. Someone whispered, "Did she move?" But Ava hadn't moved in any way they could see. Not yet. Her stance remained fluid, almost meditative. She seemed like a statue of calm amid their chaos, but they didn't yet realize statues could kill. The second cadet, emboldened by Brooks' failure, stepped forward with a wide, overconfident swing. Ava tilted her body fractionally, the tiniest angle, and his momentum carried him right past her. He stumbled forward, catching himself just short of falling, his confidence cracked but still clinging. By now, murmurs rippled through the spectators. Phones clicked, capturing every micro-movement. The atmosphere was electric. Something primal had taken hold. This wasn't a training exercise anymore. It was a silent trial of fear and control. Brooks tried again, faster this time, determined to redeem himself. His body coiled like a spring, then released, aiming a punch at Ava's midsection. But she pivoted subtly, her glove barely brushing his arm. That tiny touch sent him off balance, his momentum tipping him sideways, and he fell onto the mat with a hard thud. The yard exploded into shocked whispers and audible gasps. Cadets who had mocked her only moments ago now whispered prayers under their breath. "Please don't hit anyone else." Ava's calm demeanor never faltered. She stepped forward slowly, deliberately, letting the third cadet feel the distance between them. His eyes widened, panic rising as the wind from her movement seemed to brush against his face, though she hadn't even raised her hand. He tried strategy, tried to maintain a safe distance, circling her like a predator testing the water before striking. But Ava's eyes never left him. Every slight shift, every tiny movement was observed and anticipated. Her presence alone dictated the rhythm of the space. "Come on," he said, voice tight, almost forced. "Don't just stand there." "I am standing," she replied evenly, "but you are moving into your own mistakes." The words, calm as they were, sent a shiver down every cadet's spine watching. They had heard instructors give warnings like this before, but never like this. There was authority in her voice that felt visceral, almost dangerous. The third cadet lunged suddenly, desperation driving him forward. Ava rotated her stance just slightly. His feet left the ground awkwardly. His center of gravity betrayed him, and he slammed onto the mat, wind knocked from his lungs. The spectators froze. 12 seconds. It had been 12 seconds, maybe less, since the sparring began, and already every cadet on the mat was struggling to regain footing. Brooks scrambled, his pride warring with the sting of humiliation. This isn't fair," he shouted, though his voice cracked under the weight of exhaustion and fear. Ava's expression remained neutral. "Fair," she said softly, "is knowing your own limits before someone else points them out." The words landed like hammers. They weren't just instruction, they were a challenge, a lesson, a warning. And yet, for the first time, the cadets noticed something deeper. Ava didn't just move to block or counter. She controlled momentum, used every ounce of energy against them, and did it with such precision that it seemed unnatural. They began to understand the implication. She hadn't just been trained, she had been honed, sculpted, tested in ways that most could not survive. The yard was silent, the usual energy replaced by tension so thick it could be cut with a knife. Even the instructors watching stepped back, uncertain, their eyes narrowing. There were stories of such skill, whispered among veterans, but seeing it firsthand, that was something else entirely. One cadet whispered to his friend, barely audible, Is she even human?" Brooks coughed, getting to his knees, chest heaving. He tried to regain composure, but the sheen of sweat on his forehead betrayed his fear. The third cadet looked at him, wide-eyed, realizing that their overconfidence had been misplaced from the start. Ava crouched slightly, ready, waiting, a predator in perfect balance. The mat beneath her seemed smaller, tighter, yet every movement was deliberate, every weight shift accounted for. Then she raised one finger, slow, deliberate. The yard held its breath. The motion was simple, almost mundane, but it carried power. "You've had your turn," she said, voice low but clear. "Now listen." The cadets who had mocked her before were now silent, some too terrified to even breathe. They had underestimated her. All of them had. Ava's eyes swept over the yard once more. The whispers had started the moment she entered. Now they were gone, replaced by awe, fear, and a subtle realization. No one would approach her without respect from here on. Brooke struggled to stand, face red with exertion and embarrassment. "Ma'am, how did you?" Ava didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, the tension tightening like a drawn bowstring. Then calmly she said, "Control yourself before the world controls you." The words hit harder than any punch, slicing through bravado and ego alike. Phones continued to record, capturing every motion, every flicker of disbelief on cadet faces. Social media would later call it the 12-second spar that broke the internet, but in that moment it was real, immediate, and terrifying. The cadets on the sidelines stared at her, half in fear, half in admiration. This wasn't just skill. They realized now that this was experience, honed through danger, through missions none of them would ever survive. She had survived. They hadn't. Brooks wiped a trickle of blood from his lips, small, almost inconsequential, but it was a reminder. He had lost, utterly and completely, in a matter of seconds. And the third cadet, he still lay on the mat, trying to process what had just happened. The words he wanted to say were trapped somewhere between awe and terror. Ava finally stepped back. Her gloves loosened, her posture relaxed, but the intensity remained. She had made her point. The yard had seen it. The lesson was clear. Underestimating her would cost more than pride. And yet she had more to teach. Because this sparring wasn't about winning. It was about respect, control, survival, and she had barely begun. The cadets scrambled to regain composure, their thoughts a tangle of fear, admiration, and shame. They couldn't imagine what came next. They didn't even know what they were capable of, and Ava had already shown them that. A murmur rose among the spectators, quiet at first, then building. "Who is she? She's not just an instructor. She's something else." Ava's eyes scanned the yard one last time, unblinking, unreadable. She had already seen the cracks forming in their confidence, the hesitation that would define their next moves. The challenge had escalated. The lesson had begun. And she was just getting started. The cadets froze as Ava shifted her stance ever so slightly, a subtle movement, barely perceptible, yet it radiated command. The dirt beneath the mat seemed to hum in resonance with her presence, as if the yard itself recognized the tension. Even the wind paused, dust motes suspended midair, shimmering like a halo under the merciless afternoon sun. Brooks stepped forward again, forcing his grin, but it wavered. He cracked his knuckles, the sound loud in the sudden silence. His friends cheered quietly from the sidelines, masking their own apprehension, but the effort was weak. The energy in the yard had shifted. It wasn't just about bravado anymore. There was fear now, and a primal respect taking root in the hearts of those who had mocked her earlier. "Come on," Brooks said, his voice louder than necessary, trying to assert control, trying to convince himself as much as anyone else. "Let's see what you got, ma'am." Ava tilted her head slightly, as if studying him, reading the tension in his shoulders, the subtle trembling in his knees, the way his eyes darted for an opening that didn't exist. The three cadets were a triangle of nervous energy, circling her, attempting to coordinate, but coordination against someone like Ava was futile. The yard held its collective breath. Even the instructors at the edge of the mat leaned in, sensing the inevitable, waiting for the moment when order would collide with chaos. "Remember," Ava said softly, calm but commanding, "your control defines your outcome. Without it, you're at my mercy." Her words weren't loud, but they carried like cannon fire. Every cadet on the mat felt them reverberate through muscle and bone. Brooks lunged first, attempting a high punch aimed at her midsection. It was fast but unrefined brute force with no subtlety. Ava's body shifted by less than an inch. A blink, a breath, and Brooks stumbled forward, momentum carrying him off balance. His hand grazed her glove, the impact negligible, but it was enough to send him sprawling onto the mat with a heavy thud. Gasps erupted across the yard. Phones clicked furiously, trying to capture what no one could believe. The cadets on the sidelines whispered frantically, "Did she move? How is that even possible?" The second cadet stepped forward, emboldened by what he thought was Brooks' mistake. But as he closed the distance, Ava's eyes locked on him, unyielding. She shifted her stance again, a movement so slight it was almost invisible, and his center of gravity betrayed him. He stumbled, catching himself barely before hitting the mat, breath hitching as he realized instinctively that he was being tested, not just physically, but mentally. The third cadet, now aware of the sheer unpredictability, hesitated. He tried to maintain distance, circling, measuring, calculating, but Ava's gaze followed him with unnerving precision. Every twitch of his muscle, every tension in his limbs, she noted. It was as though she could predict the exact moment his body would betray him. "Move carefully," Ava said, her voice soft but carrying authority. "Your mistakes will cost you more than pride." The words sank like stones into water, rippling through each cadet's consciousness. Fear wasn't just a reaction anymore, it was a teacher, and it taught faster than any drill. Brooks scrambled to his feet, breath ragged, pride wounded. He charged again, this time using momentum, a desperate swing aimed high. But Ava shifted her weight subtly, guiding his energy with the faintest touch against his shoulder. He lost balance instantly, falling sideways onto the mat with a grunt, his body limp with exhaustion. The second cadet attempted to intercept, lunging from a flanking position. Ava pivoted slightly, redirecting his energy like water flowing around a rock. He stumbled past her, nearly toppling over himself, eyes wide in disbelief. The third cadet, now trembling, took a tentative step closer. His hand hovered in the air, trying to gauge distance, trying to anticipate movement. He thought he had read her, thought he could time a strike. But as he stepped forward, the tiniest adjustment in Ava's stance shifted his equilibrium. He flailed, arms windmilling, and fell to his knees, chest heaving, gaze locked on her in shock. 12 seconds had passed since the first strike. In 12 seconds, 3 cadets who had come to prove themselves were humbled, disoriented, and terrified. The spectators were silent, their excitement mingled with awe, disbelief, and a creeping fear. Phones captured every moment, every subtle adjustment, every expression of astonishment. The footage would later go viral, labeled with awestruck captions, but in that moment it was raw, live, and terrifyingly immediate. Brooks got up again, staggering slightly, wiping sweat from his brow. His pride demanded a comeback, but his body and mind betrayed him. He tried to launch another attack, wild and desperate, but Ava's stance shifted, ever so slightly, and his forward momentum carried him past her, crashing onto the mat again. The sound echoed across the yard. The third cadet groaned, pushing himself up slowly, heart hammering, realizing that physical aggression alone was futile. He looked at Ava's eyes and finally understood the truth. She was not just an instructor. She was a force of nature, honed in ways they could not comprehend. The crowd of cadets watched, breathless, caught between exhilaration and terror. Some whispered to each other, trying to rationalize what they had seen. "She's superhuman. No way that's possible. She didn't even move," and they fell. Ava finally stepped forward, breaking the spell. Her gloves loosened, her stance relaxed slightly, but the tension in the yard didn't dissipate. She had made her point. Skill, precision, and control were more powerful than brute strength or arrogance. Brooks staggered to a knee, chest heaving, pride in tatters. The third cadet collapsed beside him, trembling, realizing the fight was not a measure of their strength, It was a lesson in humility. Ava crouched slightly, surveying the scene, her eyes cold but not cruel. "Remember this," she said softly. "Control your body, control your mind, or the world will control you, and it won't be gentle." The words sank deep. They weren't just instruction, they were a warning. The cadets had been humiliated in a matter of seconds, yet the lesson was clear: underestimate her at your peril. Even the instructors standing by exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen veterans with years of combat experience struggle to achieve the kind of fluid, instinctive movement Ava displayed. Her presence alone dictated the tempo of the mat, the rhythm of the space, the flow of action. It was terrifying, mesmerizing, and humiliating all at once. Brooks finally looked up, flushed with embarrassment and adrenaline. "Ma'am, how did you?" Ava didn't answer immediately. She let the silence stretch, letting it press on them, weigh on them, crush them gently but thoroughly. Then, calm as the eye of a storm, she said, "You don't learn by winning when you don't understand the consequences of losing, and you have just begun to understand." The cadets on the sidelines absorbed the impact of her words. Whispers grew, all mixing with fear. Phones captured every motion, every nuance, every glint of sunlight off her gloves. Social media would later call it the 12-second spar that broke the training yard. But the cadets present knew the truth. This wasn't performance, it was reality. Brooks and the other cadets staggered to their feet, defeated not by injury, but by the realization of how little they understood about combat, about control, about presence. Ava had shown them power tempered by precision, the kind of lethal grace only years of experience could produce. The yard erupted into quiet chatter, not mocking, not cheering, but a hum of tension, awe, and respect. Ava's gaze swept over the cadets, reading their expressions, measuring their comprehension, noting who would internalize the lesson and who would resist it. And then, just as the murmur began to swell, Ava stepped back, gloves loosening, expression unreadable. She had ended the spar, or had she merely paused it? The cadets weren't sure. They only knew that whatever came next, they would not be ready. Because she hadn't just demonstrated skill. She had revealed a truth. Control, precision, and experience were far more terrifying than brute strength, and she had barely begun to teach the lesson. The sun beat down on the yard, dust swirling around the fallen cadets, their pride and confidence scattered alongside the grit and sweat. Ava's eyes, unyielding, swept over the crowd one last time. The whispers had started when she walked in. By the time she signaled the pause, the entire training corps understood. The real lesson was only beginning. And the next move, they would not see it coming. The yard was silent, thick with tension so palpable it felt as though the air itself had condensed. Dust swirled lazily around Ava's feet, catching the harsh sunlight like glitter, but the space seemed still, except for the 3 cadets circling her like nervous predators. Their bravado had crumbled in the previous part of the spar, replaced with something heavier: fear. Brooks stepped forward first, chest heaving, sweat dripping from his brow. Pride screamed at him to act, to redeem himself. "I can do this," he muttered under his breath, fists clenched. He lunged with reckless energy, aiming a punch at her midsection. 12 seconds. That's all it took. Before his fist even reached her, Ava shifted, not more than an inch, barely perceptible, but enough. Her movement was subtle, almost liquid, and Brooks' momentum betrayed him instantly. His foot caught the edge of the mat. The world seemed to slow. Cadets' collective breath caught in their throats. He fell sideways, thudding against the ground with a heavy, final sound. The spectators gasped in unison, phones zooming in frantically to capture every detail. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Did she even move? How is that possible? But Ava didn't react. Her expression remained calm, almost serene, the quiet eye in the center of a storm. Her gloves flexed lightly, fingers tightening and releasing, prepared for the next strike. She was a predator among prey, every micro-movement calculated, every response instinctive. The second cadet, Morris, exhaled shakily and tried to approach from a flanking angle. He had seen Brooks stumble and now panic fueled his movements. He swung with more care, a feint meant to bait her, but Ava's eyes, cold and unwavering, tracked him effortlessly. She rotated her stance, nudging just enough to redirect his energy. His momentum carried him past her, and he crashed onto the mat, wind knocked from his lungs. A murmur ran through the spectators. Cadets on the sidelines whispered, "This isn't training anymore. She's a weapon. No human moves like that." The third cadet, eyes wide, felt the tension prickling his skin. His heart pounded, each beat echoing in his ears louder than the others. He circled, trying to gauge distance, trying to anticipate her. He remembered every lesson, every tip from instructors, but instinct overrode knowledge. Fear was now a physical force, dragging at his limbs, clouding his judgment. "You're moving into mistakes," Ava said softly, her voice carrying across the mat like a whip. "Step carefully." He froze. Even standing still, he could feel the weight of her presence pressing against him. Then, with the faintest shift in her stance, the world seemed to betray him. He lunged, desperately attempting a strike, and instead of landing his fist, he tumbled forward, sprawling onto the mat with a loud thud. The sound echoed, almost theatrical, in the yard. 12 seconds had passed, and every cadet on the mat was either sprawled, struggling, or trying to comprehend what had just happened. The crowd was stunned. Phones continued to record, though some spectators didn't even bother. Their eyes were glued to the impossible reality unfolding before them. The three cadets, once filled with cocky energy, now bore expressions of raw shock. Pride had evaporated entirely, replaced by the stark recognition of how outmatched they were. Brooks scrambled to his feet again, breath ragged, pride teetering on the edge of panic. This isn't fair," he shouted, desperation bleeding into the words. His attempt to regain control was futile. Ava's eyes tracked him, unyielding, calculating. A subtle shift of weight, a step to the side, and Brooks' momentum betrayed him once more. He fell, sprawling onto the mat yet again, gasping, utterly humiliated. Morris groaned as he tried to regain footing. Sweat drenched his uniform. His chest heaved, not from exertion alone, but from the realization that brute force was meaningless here. Ava's mastery of momentum, balance, and timing had stripped him of control entirely. The third cadet, trembling, attempted a feint, a quick sidestep, a jab aimed at her torso. He misjudged by a fraction of a second. Ava rotated just slightly, letting the energy of his movement carry him forward. He crashed to the mat again, the sound echoing through the yard like a warning bell. A hush fell. The cadets on the sidelines whispered frantically, trying to rationalize what they were seeing. "She didn't even touch them," one muttered. "She barely moved." Ava stepped forward deliberately, slow, controlled, not a rush, not a flinch. Every inch of her body radiated confidence. She knelt briefly to adjust her gloves, a calm, almost meditative motion, and then straightened. The three cadets struggled to rise, winded, bewildered, humiliated. 12 seconds of chaos had left them questioning every assumption they had about skill, strength, and control. Phones clicked endlessly. The footage would be replayed, shared, dissected, commented on. Social media would call it miraculous, impossible. But for those who had lived it, there was no hyperbole. It was raw, real, and terrifying. Brooks, red-faced and shaking, managed to get to his knees. He tried to compose himself, but every instinct screamed that he was outmatched. "Ma'am, how did you?" he began, voice cracking. Ava didn't answer. She didn't need to. The silence was a lesson in itself, heavier than words could convey. She finally spoke, calm and unwavering. "You've had your turn, now listen." The cadets on the sidelines leaned forward instinctively. Every eye in the yard was locked on her. Her words were not loud, but they carried gravity, an authority born of experience few could ever claim. "Strength alone is meaningless," Ava continued. "Control yourself. Understand momentum, timing, and consequences. Learn this before the world teaches you the hard way." Murmurs ran through the spectators. They weren't just watching a sparring session, they were witnessing a master class in combat and discipline. The yard felt charged, electric, the kind of tension that leaves a mark in memory. Brooks, chest heaving, wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, minor but symbolic. He realized the truth. He hadn't lost to her fists. He had lost to her understanding of physics, strategy, and human instinct. She hadn't fought aggressively. She had demonstrated inevitability. The third cadet looked around, eyes wide, seeing their fallen friends in the awestruck crowd. His voice barely rose above a whisper. She's not human." The crowd laughed nervously, a mixture of disbelief and admiration. Ava didn't smile, didn't even flinch. She had made her point. Control, precision, anticipation, these were not taught by brute force. And now every cadet in that yard would remember the lesson, even if they couldn't articulate it. Phones continued to record. Later, clips would go viral. The 12-second spar that broke the internet would trend, but the cadets who lived it knew the truth. It wasn't entertainment. It was a warning, a promise. Ava finally stepped back, loosening her gloves, the smallest gesture of relaxation. The three cadets attempted to rise, exhausted, bewildered, humiliated, yet alive. The sun beat down on the training yard, dust settling around the fallen cadets. Every whispered word, every incredulous glance carried the same message: underestimate her at your peril. And then she spoke, quiet but with authority that carried across the mat. "Remember this feeling. Remember how quickly overconfidence turns to defeat. You will not forget it." The cadets nodded, some unwillingly, some too shocked to respond verbally. They had entered the mat with bravado. They left it with respect, fear, and awe. But Ava, she wasn't done. Because 12 seconds had proven a lesson in humility, control, and precision. The next 12 seconds would test something far more dangerous: their ability to survive, not just in training, but in the real world that awaited beyond the walls of Fort Harrington. And as the wind picked up, dust dancing like sparks around her feet, the cadets realized with a jolt: the lesson had only begun. The whispers had started the moment she walked in. By the end of 12 seconds, those whispers had transformed into something else entirely: reverence and anticipation. Because no one would walk away from her mat the same again. The dust still hung thick in the hot afternoon air, drifting in lazy spirals around the training mat. Three cadets struggled to rise, sweat soaking their uniforms, muscles trembling, pride shredded beyond repair. Their bravado had been dismantled in 12 brutal seconds, yet even in defeat, some spark of defiance lingered. Brooks clenched his fists, his chest heaving, face red with exertion and embarrassment. "This isn't over," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else, as if saying it aloud could restore some semblance of dignity. Ava stood perfectly still, gloves loose at her sides, expression unreadable. Her calm was unnerving, almost predatory. She wasn't rushing, wasn't showing off, she didn't need to. Every microsecond had its own gravity, and every cadet on the mat was acutely aware that they were still alive by luck, not skill. Morris tried again, shaking, quivering with both fear and determination. He lunged forward, attempting a wide punch aimed at her shoulder, thinking perhaps if he overcommitted he could gain momentum. But Ava shifted her weight subtly, a movement imperceptible to anyone but a trained observer. His own motion became his downfall. He stumbled, crashing to the mat with a grunt, arms splayed, chest heaving as he realized he had no control. Brooks and the third cadet froze. The realization hit them simultaneously. Brute force, raw aggression, and panic were worthless. Ava's calm control dictated everything now. Every action they took worked against them, amplified by her understanding of balance, timing, and human momentum. Brooks tried to regroup. His fists were clenched, veins bulging, heart hammering in his chest. Sweat ran into his eyes. I've got this," he stammered, but even his words betrayed panic. Ava tilted her head slightly, eyes locked on him. No flinch, no shift in expression, yet the weight of her presence was a physical force. She moved, if it could be called moving, a subtle adjustment like water reshaping itself around an obstacle. That tiny movement was enough. Brooks charged, desperation fueling every step. He threw a wild punch at her midsection, hoping sheer aggression could overcome technique. Instead, Ava guided his momentum almost casually, a nudge here, a shift there. He stumbled sideways, losing his balance, arms flailing, and slammed into the mat with a sickening thud. The spectators gasped. Phones zoomed and recorded furiously, capturing what looked impossible. The yard was filled with murmurs of disbelief. "She didn't even touch him," one cadet whispered. "She's not human." The third cadet, now shaking, took a cautious step forward, trying to gauge his chances. He knew he couldn't attack recklessly. He tried to time his movement to strike when she seemed distracted, but Ava's eyes didn't miss a beat. Her gaze was a trap, assessing, calculating, predicting. He moved, hesitated, then lunged. The tiniest misstep, less than an inch, was all Ava needed. She redirected his energy with a gentle, imperceptible push, and his own momentum hurled him onto the mat. He landed hard, breath leaving him in a painful wheeze. 12 seconds had passed again, but each strike, each fall was a lesson in inevitability. The spectators were in stunned silence. Some whispered, some laughed nervously, some held their breath. Phones captured every detail, the subtle angles, the fluidity of motion, the calm in the midst of chaos. Ava had transformed the yard into a theater of controlled destruction. Brooks tried to rise again, dragging himself upright with trembling arms. Sweat dripped into his eyes, stinging, but it didn't matter. Pride demanded action, even as logic screamed retreat. He charged once more, fists flailing, desperation etched in every movement. Ava didn't flinch. She didn't even step toward him. Yet when he lunged, her subtle rotation of her hips and the slightest pivot of her shoulder redirected his momentum, sending him crashing forward yet again. He hit the mat with a thud that echoed across the yard, every gasp of the audience punctuating the weight of defeat. Morris groaned, struggling to rise. He was trembling now, muscles trembling uncontrollably. Fear had replaced adrenaline. His mind raced, trying to anticipate the next move to find an opening. But Ava's calm control left no openings. Every approach, every strike, every misstep was instantly countered, almost invisibly, with precision that made them feel powerless. The third cadet, still on his knees, finally looked up, eyes wide with shock and fear. He had underestimated her completely. The raw, unrelenting skill she displayed wasn't just physical, it was mental, psychological. She controlled the rhythm of the fight, the flow of energy, the very outcome itself. "You're strong," Ava said quietly, finally breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, steady, but it carried a weight that made the cadets flinch. "But strength without control makes you vulnerable. Remember that." Her words landed like blows, more impactful than any strike she could have made. The cadets on the mat struggled to comprehend. Pride, embarrassment, and awe intertwined, leaving them humbled, shaken, and wide-eyed. Brooks gasped for air, voice shaking. "Ma'am, how did you?" Ava stood, gloves still relaxed, expression neutral but stern. She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, forcing the cadets to reflect. Then she spoke again. "I've lost people because they underestimated the enemy. Don't repeat that mistake." Her words struck deeper than any punch. They weren't just advice, they were a warning. A lesson born from experience, from danger, from surviving the impossible. The cadets on the sidelines whispered frantically, some still recording, some just trying to understand. Social media would later call it miraculous, impossible, viral. But for those who had lived it, there was no exaggeration. It was raw, real, and terrifying. Brooks and the other cadets struggled to rise, exhausted and humiliated. The sun beat down on the yard, dust swirling around them like sparks, catching the light in mocking glints. They were alive, yes, but changed. Humility, fear, and respect had been etched into them. Ava's gaze swept over the yard one last time. Her mission wasn't to humiliate. They were alive, intact, but they had learned a lesson they couldn't unlearn. Pride had been stripped, overconfidence shattered. Control, discipline, and precision had been demonstrated with a lethality they hadn't understood before. The spectators, who had come expecting a simple spar, realized they had witnessed something else entirely: mastery. Fear and respect intertwined in the yard, a palpable force that even the instructors felt pressing against them. Brooks wiped a trickle of blood from his lip, realizing the truth. He had not lost to her strength, nor even her reflexes. He had lost to her mastery of balance, momentum, timing, and instinct. Every misstep, every failed attack had been a lesson he could not ignore. The third cadet finally pushed himself up, trembling, eyes locked on Ava. His thoughts were a chaotic mix of awe and terror. He wanted to speak, but words failed him. Ava finally relaxed slightly, loosening her gloves further. The yard exhaled collectively, some cadets whispering, some shaking their heads in disbelief. She had made her point. The lesson had been delivered with precision. And yet in the calm aftermath, everyone knew something crucial. This was just the beginning. The tension had snapped, yes, but the real challenge, the true test, was still to come. Because Ava wasn't just a combat instructor. She was a teacher of inevitability, a master of consequence, and the cadets were only beginning to understand how deep her lessons could go. The whispers started the moment she had walked in. 12 seconds had passed. 3 cadets were humbled, winded, and terrified. And as the sun blazed overhead, dust settling around their fallen forms, one undeniable truth was clear. Ava Rourke had transformed the training yard into a crucible, and no one would ever approach her mat the same way again. The lesson had snapped, and the storm had only just begun. The training yard was thick with dust and tension, the golden sunlight glinting off worn boots and scuffed mat lines. 3 cadets lay sprawled, chest heaving, uniforms soaked with sweat. The once boastful trio had been reduced to a quiet, trembling pile of ego and panic. Silence stretched over the yard like a held breath. Ava Rourke stood in the center, gloves loose, posture calm yet commanding. The yard seemed to acknowledge her presence. Even the wind slowed, drifting lazily around her like a reluctant witness. For the first time since she had begun the spar, Ava allowed herself to exhale, though her eyes never left the cadets. This wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She hadn't meant to humiliate them. Not completely. The lesson had always been about precision, control, and respect, not about shattering pride in a display of dominance. But sometimes, reality dictated otherwise. Some lessons demanded extremes. Some students refused to understand until the consequences were unavoidable. The spectators, cadets on the sidelines, had gone from curiosity to disbelief to awe. Phones clicked relentlessly, recording every imperceptible shift, every stumble, every fall. Social media would later erupt with the footage, hashtags like 12-second Spar trending worldwide, but Ava wasn't thinking about virality. She was thinking about survival, the kind that no amount of ego or bravado could teach. Brooks groaned, pushing himself upright. His arms shook, his pride shredded, but the fire of defiance still flickered. "Ma'am, he stopped, words failing. The lesson had landed harder than any punch could. Morris, pale and trembling, finally lifted his head. Sweat dripped from his temple, his voice cracked. We didn't stand a chance." The third cadet coughed, trying to regain composure. His hands were scraped, knees bruised. He shook his head, disbelief etched across his face. "It wasn't skill, it was." He stopped, searching for the words, but they wouldn't come. Ava walked slowly among them, not a step of aggression, but a deliberate stride, surveying each cadet. She crouched slightly to adjust her gloves, a subtle, almost meditative gesture. Her presence alone was a warning. She didn't need to shout. The lesson had been delivered. And yet she felt it, the awareness that stretched beyond the mat. The commandant. The distant, Heavy boots echoed against the concrete of the academy as Commandant Harris approached, sharp eyes narrowing at the scene before him. He had heard the whispers, felt the ripple of tension that even filtered into the administrative offices. Now he was here. Ava's jaw tightened imperceptibly. She had done her duty. She had delivered the lesson. But she had never sought approval or attention from Commandant Harris. His presence meant scrutiny, and scrutiny in moments like this could complicate everything. The Commandant stopped at the edge of the mat, arms crossed, expression unreadable. His eyes swept the yard, lingering on the 3 cadets who were still catching their breath. Then they settled on Ava. "Lieutenant Rourke," he said, voice firm, precise. "I've been receiving reports footage. Care to explain what transpired here?" Ava met his gaze evenly. Calm, respectful, never apologetic. "Sir," she said, voice steady, "they challenged me. I maintained control. The lesson was about precision, timing, and awareness, not brute force. It was necessary to show them consequences for overconfidence." Commandant Harris' brow furrowed. "Necessary, yes, but some cadets are injured physically and emotionally. Their morale," he paused, the weight of his words hanging in the air like storm clouds, "is at risk. You escalated beyond protocol." Ava's jaw tightened. "With respect, sir, they underestimated the risk, underestimated the lesson. My goal was survival preparedness. If we sugarcoat skill, they will not survive what awaits them outside these walls." The Commandant's gaze didn't waver. He studied her carefully, weighing words against reputation, experience, and the undeniable reality of what had happened. "You've made your point, but perhaps the intensity was more than necessary." Ava allowed herself a controlled exhale, a subtle nod. "Sir, in 12 seconds I've shown them the consequence of misjudgment. They are alive. They understand." The Commandant's lips pressed into a thin line. Silence stretched between them, tension thicker than any mat dust. The cadets who had watched held their breath, sensing the gravity. Even the wind seemed to pause, carrying the faint scent of sweat, dust, and sunlight. Finally Harris spoke again, softer but firm. "This was impressive, but caution, Rourke. Not every lesson demands physical domination. Some require patience, observation, subtlety. You are exceptional, but even exceptional must balance intensity with guidance." Ava inclined her head slightly, absorbing the words, yet her expression betrayed nothing. Respect, yes, but restraint. The lesson had already escalated beyond restraint. She had only reacted to their challenge. The alternative, letting arrogance and overconfidence reign, was not an option. The cadets on the mat stirred, murmuring quietly among themselves. Fear still lingered in their eyes, but awe, grudging respect, and humility began to settle like dust in the wake of chaos. They had been schooled in 12 seconds, but they knew there was more to learn. One cadet finally spoke, voice shaky. "Ma'am, we understand now. I think—" His words trailed off, caught between exhaustion and revelation. Ava looked down at them, tone measured. "Understanding is only the first step. Mastery comes from repetition, discipline, and humility. Pride blinds, control reveals." The Commandant's eyes softened just slightly. "She speaks truth," he muttered, almost to himself. Then louder, addressing the cadets, "Learn it well. You have been tested. Let this lesson shape your training. Not all instructors are fortunate enough to teach with such clarity or consequence." Ava's eyes met the Commandant's briefly. There was understanding there, unspoken, of the balance between intensity and caution, of duty and discipline. She had delivered her lesson, but she also knew the challenge wasn't over, not by a long shot. The 3 cadets struggled to their feet fully, muscles shaking, pride battered but minds now sharper. They had felt defeat, humiliation, and awe all at once. But deep down they knew this was survival education. They would not forget it. And Ava, standing calmly in the center of the mat, knew one truth above all. Some lessons could only be learned the hard way. She hadn't wanted to teach it. She hadn't sought the drama. But sometimes life, arrogance, and overconfidence demanded clarity, and she was the one who delivered it. The sun blazed overhead, casting long shadows across the yard, highlighting the dust, sweat, and bruised pride of the cadets. Phones still hummed quietly, recording what would later be called legendary footage. Yet the real lesson, the one lived, felt, and internalized, was something far deeper than viral attention could capture. It was respect, control, precision, consequence. Ava stepped off the mat, gloves loosely at her sides, eyes scanning the cadets as they gathered themselves. The commandant followed, nodding subtly, acknowledging not just skill, but judgment, restraint, and the rare ability to teach the hard truth. "Remember this moment," Ava said quietly, voice carrying across the mat, resonating with power. "It will stay with you longer than any physical strike. Remember how quickly arrogance becomes vulnerability. Remember, 12 seconds can change everything." The cadets nodded, murmuring quietly among themselves. They had learned truly the cost of underestimation. And Ava knew, deep down, that her work was only beginning. Because the lesson had snapped into motion, and the consequences of underestimating her, or themselves, would continue to unfold long after the dust settled. The whispers had started when she walked in. 12 seconds had shattered pride. The commandant had arrived. Respect and fear had settled, and the true depth of the lesson was only just beginning to ripple through Fort Harrington. The storm had passed for now, but its mark was indelible. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting long shadows across Fort Harrington's training yard. Dust hung thick in the hot, stale air, swirling around boots and mat lines like sparks from an unseen fire. The three cadets who had once entered the yard full of arrogance now stood trembling, muscles taut, faces red with exhaustion and disbelief. Pride had been shattered, ego reduced to fragments scattered across the mat. Ava Rourke didn't rush. She never did. Her presence alone dictated the tempo, the rhythm, the tension. Every cadet in the yard could feel it, a pulse in the air that whispered, "Step wrong and it will cost you." Commandant Harris lingered at the edge of the mat, arms crossed, observing the scene with a mixture of awe and caution. He had seen many instructors, veterans, even combat-hardened operatives teach discipline, but Ava's approach was something altogether different. It was precise, clinical, and utterly unforgiving. "Lieutenant," he said finally, voice measured, "are you certain we should continue?" Ava's eyes met his, unwavering. "Sir, they challenged me. I have given them the lesson. Continuing will solidify understanding. If we pause now, the lesson risks being theoretical rather than real." Harris studied her for a long moment, then inclined his head slightly. "Very well, but monitor carefully. Do not push beyond necessity." The cadets, though shaken, understood what was coming. Their bodies trembled with anticipation and fear. Even Brooks, chest heaving, fists still clenched, knew this was no longer a casual sparring exercise. The mat had become a crucible, and their pride alone would not see them through. Ava took her stance. Simple, precise, controlled. Her gloves flexed lightly. She wasn't just ready, she was the storm. The cadets shifted nervously, forming a loose triangle around her, each trying to gauge distance, each trying to find a chance that did not exist. Brooks lunged first, desperation fueling his motion. A wild punch aimed at her midsection, sloppy and uncontrolled. Ava barely moved, a slight pivot, a subtle shift of weight, and his momentum betrayed him. He stumbled sideways, arms flailing, and fell onto the mat with a heavy, humiliating thud. The yard gasped. Phones clicked frantically, capturing the impossible. Cadets whispered among themselves, awe and fear intertwining. She didn't even touch him. How is this possible? Morris tried to flank her, circling cautiously, sweat running down his face. He attempted a feint, a quick jab toward her side, but Ava's eyes tracked him effortlessly. A subtle adjustment in stance, a pivot of her shoulder, and he was off balance before he even realized it. Momentum carried him forward, and he crashed onto the mat, breath knocked from his lungs. The third cadet, trembling, took a tentative step forward. His mind raced. He tried to anticipate, to time her movements, but every calculation failed. Ava had turned subtlety into a weapon. Each microshift, each weight adjustment was a lesson in inevitability. He lunged anyway, desperation overriding caution. In an instant, her foot pivoted just so, her gloves barely brushing his forearm, and his energy turned against him. He sprawled forward, arms hitting the mat hard. 12 seconds. 12 seconds, and every cadet on the mat had been humbled, disoriented, and terrified. Brooks tried to rise again, shaking violently, sweat and dust blurring his vision. Pride demanded he continue. Logic screamed he was outmatched. He lunged, fists flying. But Ava didn't flinch. Not a step, not a twitch. The slightest shift in her stance redirected his momentum yet again, and he crashed onto the mat, chest hitting with a sickening thud. The spectators were frozen in awe. The whispers began. "She's not human. She's a machine. You can't fight her." Morris groaned, struggling to regain composure. His limbs shook uncontrollably. Every instinct screamed retreat, but retreat was not in their training. They had to prove themselves. They had to survive. But survival wasn't just about strength. It was about control, timing, and awareness, skills they hadn't yet mastered. The third cadet tried a lateral strike, thinking he could find an opening. Ava shifted her weight, guiding his momentum like a river around a rock. He stumbled forward, barely catching himself, eyes wide with terror and comprehension. He realized instinctively that force alone was useless. Ava dictated the flow. She was inevitability personified. Ava's voice cut through the tension, low but firm. "Your movements betray your mind. Control your mind or it will betray you completely." The words struck deeper than any physical blow. They echoed in the cadets' minds, intertwining with fear, humiliation, and dawning respect. Each had felt the consequences of miscalculation. Each had tasted defeat that wasn't measured in bruises, but in momentum turned against them. Brooks attempted to rally, fists clenching tighter. He lunged again, desperation fueling motion. Ava's gloves barely touched his forearm, subtle redirection sending him tumbling yet again. The thud echoed, a rhythm of defeat, and the cadets on the sidelines instinctively leaned in, captivated by the impossible display. Morris, trembling, finally shouted, We can't." The words were cut off as Ava shifted, body fluid and controlled, redirecting his momentum into the mat. He landed hard, gasping, face pressed into the canvas. The third cadet, shaking, tried to stand his ground. His legs wobbled as fear and fatigue battled with pride. He lunged once more, a half-hearted strike, but Ava's pivot redirected him in an instant. He hit the mat with a dull thud, arms splayed, breath leaving him. The yard was silent except for the rasping of cadets' breaths. Phones clicked, but even the spectators could barely process what they had witnessed. Ava had stripped them bare, not just of ego, but of misconception, overconfidence, and illusion. Brooks finally slumped onto his knees, gasping, sweat dripping into his eyes. "Ma'am, I caw." His words trailed into despair. Ava crouched slightly, gloves loose, voice calm yet precise. "And that is why control matters. Force alone is irrelevant. Momentum, timing, awareness, these are survival. You will remember this, not for shame but for clarity." The commandant stepped forward, nodding slightly. "She speaks truth. This is not humiliation, it is education." Brooks, Morris, and the third cadet looked up at Ava with raw emotion. Awe, fear, respect, and an unspoken understanding. They had entered the mat brimming with confidence, and now they understood the fragility of pride. Ava finally stepped back, letting the silence stretch. The lesson was complete, but the impact would resonate far beyond the mat. Each cadet had learned more in 12 seconds than most would in months of training. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the yard. Dust settled over sweat-slicked uniforms, marking the aftermath of chaos turned into clarity. Phones continued to record, Social media would later explode, but none of that mattered. What mattered was the imprint left on the cadets' minds. Ava's voice, calm and controlled, carried across the yard. Remember this feeling. Remember the consequences of overconfidence. This is your benchmark. Control your body, control your mind, control your life. Brooks finally swallowed, nodding. Morris, still trembling, forced his legs to obey, rising slowly. The third cadet met Ava's eyes, understanding at last that she had not been cruel, she had been necessary. The commandant looked on, silent for a moment, then said quietly, almost reverently, "Few teach this way. Fewer survive the lesson intact. You are extraordinary." Ava inclined her head slightly, eyes sweeping the yard, assessing every cadet, every expression, every flicker of comprehension. She hadn't just won a sparring match. She had reshaped understanding, rebuilt humility, and imposed respect. The cadets understood now. 12 seconds could define you, break you, or teach you truths you couldn't ignore. And Ava Rourke was the teacher who delivered it in the purest form, reality. The whispers that had begun when she first entered the yard had transformed into something heavier. Respect, fear, awe. The storm had not passed. It had arrived. And in the fading sunlight, as shadows stretched long across the mat, one undeniable truth remained. No cadet would ever underestimate Ava Rourke again. The reckoning was complete. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the training yard in hues of amber and steel gray. Shadows stretched across the worn mats, the dirt-streaked uniforms of the cadets, and the glint of sweat and dust still clinging to skin and fabric. The air carried the heavy, electric weight of the day's events, each heartbeat resonating with lessons burned into memory. Brooks, Morris, and the third cadet, names etched into Ava's mind not for derision, but for survival, sat on the edge of the mat, chests heaving, limbs trembling, eyes wide in a mixture of awe and exhaustion. Their pride had been shattered, their overconfidence dismantled, and yet beneath the shock, something new had begun to grow: humility, respect, and the sharp edge of comprehension. Commandant Harris lingered nearby, his tall frame silhouetted against the last streaks of light. He had seen many instructors command respect, even fear, but Ava Rourke's methods left an impression that would outlast any single sparring session. He observed her, noting the subtle tension in her posture, the calm precision in her every gesture, the unspoken authority that radiated from her like a tangible force. Ava moved slowly across the mat, gloves hanging loosely at her sides. Every step was measured, deliberate. She didn't hurry. She didn't need to. The lesson had already been delivered. The impact, however, extended far beyond the physical. "Stand up," she said softly, her voice carrying across the mat like a ripple through water. The cadets obeyed, knees wobbling, hands pressed against the canvas for support. Brooks looked at her, chest heaving, sweat dripping into his eyes. He wanted to speak but found the words tangled in disbelief. Finally, he muttered, "Ma'am, I didn't know anyone could." His sentence faltered, unspoken meaning hanging heavy in the air. Ava's gaze softened slightly, though it retained its steel edge. "You will remember this," she said quietly. "Not for humiliation, not for pride lost, but for clarity gained. Brute strength can only take you so far. Control, awareness, and precision define survival. Do you understand?" The three cadets nodded, voices barely above a whisper. "Yes, ma'am." "Good," Ava said, stepping back and lifting her gloves slightly, flexing her fingers. The tension in the yard began to ebb, replaced by a reverent quiet. The spectators, who had watched in awe, whispered among themselves. Phones continued to click and record, but the real lesson could not be captured on film. It was living, breathing, and etched into the minds of those who had survived it. The commandant approached, his expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Rourke," he said, voice firm but respectful. "You've done more than teach a lesson today. You've reshaped understanding. Few instructors possess the discipline or the restraint to deliver such clarity without excess." Ava inclined her head slightly, acknowledging the words but offering no further explanation. She had done her duty, nothing more. The lesson was not about accolades or recognition. It was about survival, discipline, and the unvarnished reality of consequences. The three cadets struggled to straighten their uniforms, still trembling. Their faces were pale, eyes wide, and yet there was something in their gaze that had changed. Fear had transformed into comprehension, awe had become respect, and humiliation had been tempered by the hard edge of truth. They were no longer the arrogant boys who had stepped onto the mat. They were students, and they had been profoundly taught. Brooks finally spoke, voice steadying. "Ma'am, thank you. I understand now, completely." Morris nodded, hands gripping the edges of the mat. "I won't forget this, ever." The third cadet, still shaking slightly, added, We've learned more in 12 seconds than months of drills." Ava's lips curved slightly, almost imperceptibly. "Good," she said. "Remember that. Respect your limits, respect your training, and most of all, respect the consequences of underestimating reality." The sun had fully set, leaving the yard bathed in twilight. Shadows of cadets, instructors, and spectators stretched across the dirt and mats, the atmosphere thick with reflection. Ava walked slowly toward the exit of the yard, each step deliberate. Behind her, the cadets remained on the mat for a moment longer, absorbing the gravity of what had just transpired. Even in silence, the lesson continued to resonate. It was more than physical mastery. It was the understanding that confidence without control was fragile, that arrogance could be dismantled in seconds, and that survival was not just about strength, but about presence, awareness, and precision. Commandant Harris approached the cadets quietly, placing a hand on Brooks' shoulder. "You've been tested in a way few ever are," he said. "You have witnessed discipline and skill at its peak. Let this shape your future." The cadets nodded, their faces a mixture of reverence and lingering disbelief. The weight of the day pressed on them, but so did a newfound understanding. They had seen the consequences of overconfidence. They had experienced the lesson in its rawest form. Ava paused at the edge of the mat, turning briefly to look back at them. "This is not the end," she said softly. "It is only the beginning. What you do with this lesson will define you far more than anything I have demonstrated." Her words, calm and deliberate, carried a weight that no physical strike could match. They sank into the cadets' consciousness, mingling with the memory of their own failings, the awe of their instructor's mastery, and the raw, unfiltered lesson of reality. As she exited the yard, the crowd of cadets, instructors, and spectators remained silent, watching her retreating figure. The legend of the 12-second Spar would be told and retold, recorded and replayed, but the true impact, the change etched in the minds and hearts of those who had lived it, was immeasurable. Brooks, Morris, and the third cadet rose fully, finally standing upright, their movements cautious, deliberate. The fear that had gripped them was fading, replaced by determination and humility. They had been broken, yes, but from that fracture came clarity. They would carry this lesson into every drill, every exercise, every challenge that lay ahead. Commandant Harris watched the cadets closely, noting the subtle shift in posture, the steadying of breath, the newfound focus in their eyes. "She has left an impression," he muttered, almost to himself. "Not just as a fighter, but as a teacher of consequence." Ava disappeared beyond the horizon of the training yard, her presence lingering like a storm just past, leaving only the resonance of discipline, fear, and respect. The cadets would speak of her in hushed tones, the story growing with each retelling. But for those who had survived the 12 seconds, the lesson was immutable, eternal. The twilight deepened, the air cooling, carrying with it the quiet promise of reflection. The training yard, once a place of challenge and arrogance, now felt sacred, an arena where pride had been tested, humility instilled, and survival etched into memory. Brooks finally spoke, voice quiet but resolute. "We'll be better, stronger because of her." Morris nodded, "And we'll never forget." The third cadet added, voice trembling but firm, "Not 12 seconds, but a lifetime of lessons." Somewhere beyond the yard, Ava's shadow disappeared into the fading light, leaving behind a legacy that would ripple through Fort Harrington for years. She had taught not just skill, not just control, not just consequence, but the essence of survival itself. And though the 12 seconds were over, their impact would echo forever. The legend had been born, the cadets had been transformed, and the storm, quiet now but ever present, had left its mark. The whispers had started when she first entered. They would never truly end. Because Ava Rourke wasn't just a lesson, she was inevitability itself. And those who had faced her would carry that truth for the rest of their lives.